Welcome to this discovery session, Narrating the Margins, How Storytelling Can Facilitate the Inclusive Classroom. I'm Adrianne Hanson, an associate professor at Ashford University. I came up with the idea for this session while teaching English 317, International Voices. It's a course in which students read a variety of texts from different cultures and countries around the world. I was struck with how engaged students were with the stories of others so different from themselves. I began thinking about how fundamental stories are to our daily lives and wondering how we can put them into our courses as a way of explaining difficult concepts and also coming to a greater understanding of each other. Thank you for joining me for this session. And please, my email is at the end on the final slide. Do contact me if you'd like to continue the conversation. Welcome to this discovery session, Narrating the Margins, How Storytelling Facilitates the Inclusive Classroom. In this presentation, we will consider how instructors and course designers can use stories and storytelling in the online classroom in order to engage students, tackle difficult concepts, and foster an atmosphere of cooperation and understanding. Let's start by thinking about stories. Why stories? Why are they important? Stories really shape our lives at a very fundamental level. Stories are used to sell a product. Think about the advertisements that we see on television. Think about those wonderful Super Bowl ads that everybody looks forward to every year. We read stories in the newspaper and on blogs. We read stories in opinion pieces. Those are often used to change an opinion. Stories create empathy in us. We can even use stories to get the job. Think about a job interview in which you've told a very brief story about how you succeeded in a particular area or project. Stories can influence our decisions, inspire us. They also shape our relationships. We tell our stories to others, they tell their stories to us, and it's a way we can identify with each other. So they really shape us at a very fundamental level and come into our lives every day. There are two quotes, one by Madeleine L'Engle and one by Maya Angelou, that really set the tone. Madeleine L'Engle talks about the humanity in stories and how stories connect us to each other and to the universal human experience. She says stories make us more alive, more human, more courageous, more loving. And Maya Angelou says there is no greater agony than bearing an untold story within you. And I think we've really seen this with underrepresented groups in literature who just in the last 20, 30 years have been encouraged to tell their stories. I have a photograph here of Joseph Conrad in the Congo. He's the author of Heart of Darkness, which is one of those canonical texts that we read in British literature. This was taken in the 1890s, and I bring this into my British Literature 2 course as students are reading the novel, and they're really awakened to European imperialism in the 19th century and the horror of that. And then we start talking about modern day equivalents and can they relate that in some way to our experience today. The students are often surprised to realize that there are still sweatshops there in the Congo. There's still child labor in the mines, and so they are connected to what's going on in the world today through a text that was written over 100 years ago. Again, literature is easy. It's really a subject where stories are naturally woven in to the fabric of the course, and it's through stories and narrative that we talk about history and culture and identity and ourselves. So we're going to try to talk a little bit about how these concepts of telling stories to find out more about ourselves can be applied to other topics, other subjects across the curriculum. There are 3 learning outcomes for this session. First, we're going to look at the elements of effective storytelling, those elements that I believe can facilitate conversations about culture and identity. We'll look briefly at social identity theory, which offers a framework for understanding how the social and cultural margins are depicted in narrative. And by narrative, we mean both written and visual, also oral or audio narratives. And then third, we'll talk a little bit about some strategies for integrating those narratives of diversity and inclusion in courses across the curriculum. How can you integrate stories and storytelling in your classroom in order to tackle difficult concepts, to clarify course content, and to create an atmosphere of greater understanding within the course? Let's look briefly at the basic elements of storytelling. Now, these are things that you will already know, but they're worth a brief review as we go on and talk about a little more advanced concepts later. So plot. Plot is what happens in the story, the action, character, the who, the protagonist, the antagonist, the secondary characters, setting, place, time, historical, cultural context. And then we have style. Style can be the tone in which the story is written, the point of view, whether it's written in the first person I voice, the third person he, she voice, symbolism, metaphor, other literary devices, use of language. And then medium or genre. Are we talking about a short story, a novel, a poem, a blog, an oral narrative, perhaps a film, an audio-visual narrative? Now, for our purposes today, we're going to focus on the top 2, plot and character. Those are going to be our focus. Now, fiction writers and screenwriters talk about the difference between a plot-driven story and a character-driven story. Now, a plot-driven story is a story that centers around the plot. The plot is the motivating device. And some examples of that would be the Da Vinci Code, any of the Mission Impossible films, anything by Harrison Ford, Raiders of the Lost Ark. Now, in a plot-driven story, character is important. There will be some development of character throughout the story. To give you an example of a Tom Cruise film, you have the young hotshot pilot who, over the course of events, learns about himself, comes into his own, becomes a little bit more mature, responsible. Just about any Tom Cruise film follows that paradigm. But in a plot-driven story, character is not the most important thing. It's there, but it's not really what we're focusing on. In a character-driven story, character is what shapes the entire storyline, and plot really serves character. Some examples of that would be The Sixth Sense, The Martian, Black Swan, 7 Pounds. Another film I enjoyed recently was Joy with Jennifer Lawrence, Age of Adeline. So any of those films we would consider to be character driven. If you've read the novel All the Light We Cannot See, which is a story about a blind girl living through the Nazi occupation in World War II in a small French village. So we experience the war through her character and her character development. So that's what we when we talk about character driven, that's what we mean. And for our purposes today, we're going to focus on character and character driven narratives, because that is where we really get into the meat of identity issues. And students considering not only where they fit into their own narratives, but how they relate to the narratives of others. If you're interested in this topic, the classic work is Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey. This was originally a documentary film that came out in 1987. You can still find it on Amazon, possibly on PBS. And Joseph Campbell talks about the steps in the hero's journey. And when you look at classic literature, going back to the Homeric epics, you see that there are the same stages of character development that a hero goes through from the beginning of a story to the end. Around 1990, Joseph Campbell put his thoughts into a book. And around the same time, Maureen Murdoch wrote The Heroine's Journey. She asserts that women's journey, women in fiction and in stories, have a slightly different journey than male heroes. So if you're interested in that topic, I would recommend those two works. Here is a graphic that kind of gives you an overview of Joseph Campbell's theory of the hero and how the hero appears in literature. It's quite detailed, but it's interesting to take perhaps your favorite story, novel, film, take a look at where the hero fits into this paradigm, or also even your own life. It might be interesting too to share this with students if you think it is relevant in the classroom. Here is the heroine's journey, slightly different from the hero's journey. Again, these are just resources if you find them relevant for your particular foray into storytelling, or if you think they may be of interest to the students. The one model that I want to focus on is one that fiction writers use today, and this is the basic trajectory of a story. And a story will start in ordinary time. The ordinary time is just the everyday life of the hero. And then an inciting incident comes along. That is the incident that sets the hero on the path of adventure. We have rising action. Lots of things happen to deter the hero on his or her journey, to get in the way of that self-development or the action. And then we come to the black moment. That is a moment of crisis. It's not only a moment in which something riveting or life-shattering is happening in the plot, but it's also a moment in which development is happening within the hero himself or herself. The black moment leads to the climax of the story, and then you have the resolution and the return to ordinary time or ordinary life. Of course, it's never going to be ordinary ever again because the hero has gone through this great transformation. So it's going to be a new phase. And it's important to note that this model happens both externally in the plot and internally in the hero. So you have that external story, that action, but then you have the personal development and the change of mind and the change of identity within the hero or heroine. Conflict is everything. Conflict is what sets the plot and the character development in motion, and it's what drives the story. And it is the resolution of conflict that provides the end of the story. To give you an example of this, we can talk about, let's talk briefly about Lord of the Rings. Frodo. Frodo is one of those unlikely heroes who doesn't really want the job, but rises to the occasion. So we have Frodo in the Shire, enjoying his life with his friends. That's at ordinary time. The inciting incident. He has left this ring by his uncle. Now, some would say that the inciting incident happens in Elvendale, in Elrond's council, in which they are deciding that they need to go get rid of the ring and throw it into Mount Doom, and Frodo decides that he needs to go along. So you can debate what the inciting incident is, but the ring, the discovery of the ring, is really the launching pad there. You have a lot of action. It goes through 3 whole books of rising and falling action. You have several black moments. You could argue that anytime Frodo is tempted to put the ring on, to disappear from enemies, that is a black moment. Is he going to give himself to this force? Or is he going to stay true to himself? But probably the essential black moment is when he is attempting to throw that ring into the fires of Mount Doom, and he's wondering, can he really do this? And the power of the ring is seducing him to put this on his finger. Of course, the climax is then when Gollum takes the ring and falls into the fires of Mount Doom. In the resolution there, you have Frodo returning to ordinary time, his ordinary life in the Shire, but it's never going to be ordinary. He is a changed person, and as you know from the end, he ends up making the journey to Rivendell because he just can't stay in the Shire because he's been transformed so much through this experience. So you can take just about any of your favorite narratives and plug them into this particular model. Now that we've established some of the elements of storytelling and narrative, I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about social identity theory, because what I want us to do is meld together those elements of storytelling with ideas about social identity and its construction, and see what the implications of that are for storytelling in the classroom. Social identity theory was developed in the late 70s by Tobel and Turner, who said that social identity is defined as a person's sense of who they are based on their membership in a group. Now, a group could be a social class, an ethnic group, a gender, even a sports team, an age demographic, a specific job or occupation, or even union membership. So membership in that particular group becomes a source of pride, a source of self-esteem, a source of identity. So Tobel and Turner also asserted that because of this, stereotyping is a normal cognitive process, and that people tend to exaggerate differences between groups in order to establish that us-them paradigm. Thus, people also exaggerate the similarities of those in the same group in order to establish that identity. And I think this is interesting questions to consider. Is stereotyping really a normal cognitive process? Do we really exaggerate those differences? Do we exaggerate similarities? Are we getting better at that? Or are we not? Do we still have a lot of work to do? Again, social identity theory is about 35 years old. It's become more specified. Now we have things like critical race theory, which break this down into at even a deeper level. But this gives us an overview for looking at how social identity is constructed. So Tobel and Turner outlined 3 steps that we use in evaluating others. Steps that we use to create that us versus them paradigm, the in-group versus the out-group. Again, this is a very mainstream theory now, but it's a good reminder of how we construct our social identity. First, we establish categories. Next, we identify with the traits or the ideologies or other aspects of those categories. And then we compare ourselves to others in different categories. This is a way of understanding, again, how we determine difference and how we focus on difference or choose not to focus on difference, and other understanding of how we develop prejudices, either individually or as a society. So where does storytelling intersect with social identity theory? Hogg and Reed in their study write that people use accessible categories to make sense of their social context. Yet, in doing so, this kind of categorization depersonalizes our perception of people. So stories are great at constructing representations of social categories. They also compel us to consider the social and cultural margins of our communities and the potential barriers to collaboration and understanding. So stories do a lot of things. They shape our identities. They help us form perceptions of others, either correctly or incorrectly. Stories can illuminate difference. They can elicit identification and empathy. They help us to establish categories and comparisons, but they also help to subvert those categories and comparisons. They challenge us. One example would be the Southern writer Flannery O'Connor, who tends to write about middle class and working class people in the South. She was writing earlier in the 20th century. And I often ask students, how much do you think she stereotypes the American South? Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? What do we learn from that? And how does she challenge our thinking? So as we consider how fundamental stories are in shaping our identities and in our perception of others, how can we use storytelling in the classroom? How can we use it to narrate the margins? How can we also use it to affirm students and their unique experiences, engage in difficult topics, and also promote inclusion? So I want you to think a little bit about where stories appear in your classroom. There are some places where stories are student generated. Students often tell their stories in the post your introduction forum. Some students are very brief. Some students give very detailed narrations about their lives, their past, where they've come from, where they're going. I think it's important to not overlook those. Stories can appear in discussion posts, either students giving a story, an instructor conveying a story that might be relevant. A student might weave personal experience into a written assignment, depending on the course and the assignment and how appropriate that is. You may hear a story in an email or in a chat. And then there are stories that are instructor and course generated. Stories may appear in the assigned readings. You may integrate them into your guidance. There may be videos that students are required to watch, case studies, or stories that illustrate specific concepts. So consider where stories appear in your classroom. And then also consider how stories are used uniquely within your discipline, because this is going to look very different when you're in an English class than when you are in a business class or a leadership class or a psychology classroom. I have some examples of how storytelling is used in different disciplines. One example is from linguistics and anthropology. In one of our linguistics courses, we introduced students to a documentary titled The Linguists. And this is about two linguists, David and Greg, who set out to document 4 endangered languages. They go out into the field, they record the languages, they interview native speakers of those languages, and we talk with students about that relationship between language, identity, and community, and what happens to a community when its language disappears. So the story in this case is the story of a language, of its development, of its endangerment, and possible extinction. Another example is from an English literature class titled International Voices, where students read texts from a variety of different cultures and ethnic groups written in English. And one of the texts they read is by Mary Crow Dog, who has passed away, but she was a very influential Native American activist. She was active in the Native American movement in the 1970s. Her autobiography is titled Lakota Woman. There's a chapter in that autobiography titled Civilize Them with a Stick. And it talks about her upbringing in a Native American boarding school. These were schools established by the American government in order to fully integrate Native American children into what was perceived as normal American culture. And in addition to talking about these children on the margins and this forced assimilation into American culture, I show, or what is perceived as American culture at the time. I show students a series of photographs from the archive at Eastern Illinois University, and it's interesting to see the photograph here, which is from around 1900, and you see that the Native American culture has literally been whitewashed out of these children's lives. In another photograph, you'll see the classroom in which the students study. It's very bare of any kind of decorations. The students here are forced to wear a uniform white. So this is an interesting text for students to consider, and many can relate that to their own experience of feeling perhaps marginalized in their own community. Carmine Gallo is a business leader, speaker, and pundit who has written a book titled The Storyteller's Secret: From TED Speakers to Business Legends, Why Some Ideas Catch On and Others Don't. And the citation for his book is in the references section at the end of the presentation. But in his book, he talks about how the greatest business ideas of our time were sold not through data or not through theories, or not through basic proposals, but through stories, and how it's the stories of those products coming into being and those businesses being developed that are inspirational. And he gives the example of Howard Schultz. And what's compelling about Howard Schultz, the founder of Starbucks, is his background growing up in a working class home in which his father lost his job. They didn't have health insurance. And his experiences as a child really shaped how he sees business, how he sees employees. One example being Starbucks is a company that offers all of their employees health insurance. So in business, we also see those stories of products being developed, of companies being built. A few other examples in fields like sociology, psychology, perhaps education. The kinds of stories that will appear in the classroom will be case studies. There'll be experimental studies, research. In a field like marketing and advertising, of course, story is everything. I mentioned earlier the example of the Super Bowl ads. Often the Super Bowl ads are talked about long after the game is even mentioned. A classic one from 2014 is the Budweiser Puppy Love Super Bowl commercial, and you'll probably remember that one. But in all of these stories, no matter what discipline, the key is to think about the conflict. As Gallo says, we are hardwired to find meaning in struggle. So in these stories that we tell in the classroom and our students tell us, where is the struggle and where is the meaning in that struggle? Where is the conflict or challenge and how is it overcome? If you don't have conflict, you don't have a story. If you don't have a protagonist overcoming a conflict, you don't have a story. And that is really, I think, what reaches students' experience when they think about their own conflicts in their own lives, how they are overcoming those, and how their individual experiences relate to those that are being narrated in the classroom. So I want us to think a little bit about our own classes and our own disciplines and how we can apply some of this. And I have an exercise here. Consider one story or narrative in a course that you teach. Whether you teach a literature course and this is an actual story, short story or novel, or whether this is a story in a business course, a story of a company being developed. Perhaps you teach a psychology or sociology course and this is a case study, but consider one story or narrative in a course that you teach. Go back to those elements of storytelling, the ordinary time, the inciting incident that sets a person on his or her journey of development, that black moment where he or she is forced to make a decision, and then the climax of that story, and then the resolution, and how is the person different at the end. Where do you see those elements of storytelling within this particular narrative in your course? Are there points in the story that intersect with students' own experiences? Or are there points in the story that depart radically from students' own experiences? And can these story points provide a way of discussing course content in a new way, perhaps illuminating some of the theoretical concepts in a new way, or making the overall content relevant to students' identities and students' experiences? How can you challenge students through the telling of the story in your course? Perhaps you don't have any stories in your course, or you don't see them readily available in the course. This exercise number 2 would be more for you. Where in your course could you insert a story or narrative in order to better illustrate an important concept? Is there a way in which a story could better explain a theory or concept than just raw definitions or raw data? Then, after you've thought of a story that you can insert into your class, what sections of the course would be the most appropriate place for that? In an online course, we have a variety of tools. We have the announcements feature, there's discussions, students complete written assignments. You will provide feedback on discussions and written assignments. Also, as an instructor, you are putting guidance into your course. Where are places in that course where you can integrate a story? Also consider not just written stories, but visual, audio, and multimedia narratives. There's a lot of great stuff in films on demand, a lot of great stuff on YouTube, photographs. Consider all mediums that you could possibly use to convey a story. And then how can that story be used to foster dialogue, celebrate difference, and encourage inclusion? And I would assert that these are not questions that you as an instructor or course designer necessarily have to answer. I think these are questions that you can throw out to the students and ask them how this narrative can be used to foster dialogue, celebrate difference, and encourage inclusion. Stories and storytelling have the power to affirm cultural and ideological diversity and to create a more inclusive classroom. And as we have seen, they also have the power to help us explain more clearly course content and difficult theoretical concepts. As Gallo says in The Storyteller's Secret, we are wired for story. It is who we are. We live for stories on a daily basis. We enjoy them. They help define us. And also, as Joseph Campbell says in The Hero's Journey, the fundamental human experience is that of compassion. And I think that is really key. The goal of stories is empathy, to get us to understand the experience of the other. And I think particularly in today's world, that is something that we need more of. I have a list of references you might find interesting. Please feel free to look through those. I'm available for questions or for continued dialogue if this is a topic that interests you. I'm hoping you can use some of these ideas in your classroom. Thank you for joining me for this discovery session. Please do email me if you have any questions or if you would like to continue a conversation. Enjoy the rest of the conference.